Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we're taking a very different approach. We aren't doing theology today.
Right, no debates about whether God physically exists up in the clouds or if miracles actually happen.
Exactly. Instead, we are looking at religion purely through the lens of psychoanalysis, specifically the later work of Sigmund Freud. And the central tension we're exploring right up front is his most, I'd say, dangerous claim.
Which is that God is not an external reality at all.
Right. God is an internal psychological projection. Freud basically calls religion a universal obsessional neurosis that was born from this ancient history of murder, crushing guilt, and the return of repressed memories.
It is a pretty heavy way to start. We are essentially putting all of humanity on the therapy couch and asking, why are you acting like this?
Yeah, it sounds like a true crime thriller, but for the entire human race. It really centers on that tension between belief and atheism, taking the divine totally out of the equation. So what are we actually looking at today? What's the stack of sources for this deep dive?
We are pulling from three of Freud's major works that form a sort of trilogy on this topic. We have Totem and Taboo, a much shorter paper called Obsessive Actions and Religious Practices, and finally his last and arguably most controversial book, Moses and Monotheism.
And the mission here is to figure out why humanity felt the need to invent God, according to Freud, and how a very specific historical trauma created the monotheistic religions we know today.
Precisely. To understand the big picture, the cathedrals, the holy wars, the deep theology, we have to start very small. We have to start inside the individual mind.
Before we jump into that universal neurosis idea, I just want to say quickly, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It really helps us keep these deep dives going.
And it is a habit you definitely want to keep, unlike the neuroses we are about to discuss.
True. Okay, so let's unpack this. This comes from that 1907 paper. Freud is looking at his patients, people with severe neuroses, and then he looks at religious people performing rituals, and he basically says, I'm seeing the exact same picture.
He noticed a striking similarity between obsessive actions, what we might call ceremonials today, and religious rituals. Think about someone with severe OCD.
Right.
They might feel this overwhelming urge to check the door lock 10 times or arrange the items in their room in a rigid, very specific way. To an outsider, it looks totally meaningless.
To the neurotic, it's vital, because if they don't do it, the anxiety just completely takes over.
Exactly. It is a defense mechanism. They perform the ritual to ward off a specific anxiety or to suppress a bad memory. And Freud gives a fascinating, if slightly uncomfortable example in the source material.
Oh, right, the woman with the tablecloth?
Yes. He talks about a woman who had this bizarre compulsion to run from her room into another room where there was a specific table. She would pull the tablecloth in a very precise way to cover a stain, and then she would call her maid into the room.
Which just seems completely random to anyone watching. Why was she doing that?
Well, Freud dug into her history, and it turned out this ritual was a subconscious reenactment of her wedding night. Her husband had encountered let's say, a performance issue. He was impotent that night.
Right.
And in the morning, to avoid embarrassment when the hotel maid came in, he grabbed a bottle of red ink and poured it on the sheets to fake the evidence of a consummated marriage.
Oh, wow. That is incredibly specific.
And he did it clumsily, in the wrong spot. So years later, this woman is running around adjusting tablecloths to cover a stain. She was symbolically fixing her husband's failure, engaging in this repetitive ritual to manage that memory and the intense shame associated with it.
So she is just trapped in a loop trying to fix the past. And here is where Freud makes the leap, which is really interesting. He looks at that neurotic behavior, then he looks at a religious person praying the rosary, or bowing towards Mecca, or isolating themselves for worship, and he says the mechanism is identical.
It creates a perfect parallel for him. Religious rituals are just public, shared versions of those private neurotic rituals. The believer feels a deep internal pressure to perform the ceremony.
And if they skip it, they feel anxiety or guilt, just like the woman with the tablecloth.
Exactly. Freud argues that just like the neurotic is trying to repress a specific instinct or a painful memory, religion is humanity's way of repressing bad, antisocial instincts.
So religion is essentially a collective defense mechanism. We perform the rituals to keep our own dark urges, like murder or extreme violence, in check. It's not about honoring a god up in the sky, it's about managing ourselves.
That is the absolute core of his argument. The neurotic represses individual instincts, while religion represses the instincts of the entire human species.
Which is a massive paradigm shift. It frames religion entirely as a psychological coping strategy. But Freud claims this isn't just about how our brains work in a vacuum. It's tied to our actual history. Something horrific happened to us as a species. Which takes us to totem and taboo.
Right, this is where Freud goes all the way back to the beginning. He adopts a hypothesis from Charles Darwin regarding the primal horde.
This is basically the horror movie section of the theory.
It is incredibly violent. The idea is that in the earliest, most primitive days of humanity, we didn't live in civilized family units. We lived in violent hordes dominated by a single, wildly jealous, powerful, primal father.
The ultimate alpha male.
The absolute authority. This father kept all the women for himself and violently drove away his sons as they came of age. He allowed zero competition. He was the law.
But obviously, you can only push people so far before they snap. And this leads to what Freud calls the primal crime.
Yes. The expelled sons, realizing they couldn't defeat the father individually, banded together. They returned, overpowered the father, and murdered him. And because they were cannibals, which was a common stage of development, they ate him.
Okay, hold on. They literally ate him. Or is Freud being metaphorical here?
No, Freud means it literally. In these ancient totem cultures, consuming the physical parts of an enemy or a powerful beast was a way to internalize their strength. They wanted the father's power, so they consumed his flesh.
That is gruesome. But this massive act of violence, it didn't actually lead to freedom for the brothers, did it?
No, it didn't. And this is the most critical psychological pivot point in the whole theory. This is where Freud introduces the concept of emotional ambivalence.
And ambivalence here doesn't just mean being indecisive, right? Freud means something much deeper.
Much deeper. He means the simultaneous existence of intense love and intense hate toward the exact same person. The sons hated the father because he was a tyrant who stood in their way. But they also deeply admired him. They loved him as protector and an idol of ultimate power.
So once they kill him, the hate is finally satisfied.
The hate is satisfied, and because the hate is gone, the love comes rushing back to the surface. But because the object of their love is now dead by their own hands, that love transforms into crushing, unbearable remorse. This is the birth of guilt. Freud argues this specific moment, the killing of the primal father, is the actual origin of the human superego, our conscience.
That's a staggering thought. Our conscience doesn't come from a divine spark from God. It comes from the collective guilt of prehistoric murder. So how do these brothers possibly deal with this massive psychological hangover?
They created totemism. To assuage the guilt, they needed a system. They chose an animal, the totem, to represent the murdered father. And they established two fundamental, unbreakable taboos to ensure they never repeated the crime.
And these taboos correspond directly to the two things the father controlled.
Right. Taboo number 1. You absolutely cannot kill the totem animal. This creates a psychological and cultural barrier against ever killing the father figure again.
And taboo number 2.
You cannot have sex with the women of your own clan. This is the origin of exogamy and the incest taboo. They basically denied themselves the very prize they had killed the father to obtain. They said, "We killed him for this, but the guilt is so horrific we will voluntarily give it up forever."
That is the real aha moment here. Freud is saying this prehistoric murder is the origin of human morality. The command, "thou shalt not kill," isn't a divine order handed down from a mountain. It's a traumatized reaction to the guilt of having slaughtered the father.
Exactly. And as time passed, worshipping an animal totem wasn't enough to handle the psychological weight. The longing for the actual father figure grew stronger. Eventually, the animal was replaced by human-shaped gods. Freud argues that God is simply the projected memory of that primal father. We fear God, yet we desperately look to him for protection, just like those primal sons feared and loved their dad.
So God is just a ghost, a collective ghost of a murdered father projected onto the universe to make us feel safe.
That is the ultimate conclusion of totem and taboo.
Okay, I can sort of follow the logic for a primitive, generalized religion. Cavemen, spirits, totems, that makes sense. But Freud doesn't stop there. He takes this massive sweeping theory and applies it to one of the most specific, highly developed religions in history, Judaism. And this is where he really shakes the hornet's nest in his book, Moses and Monotheism.
It is definitely his boldest work. He tries to bridge the gap between that prehistoric cannibal horde and the highly sophisticated monotheism of the Bible. And he does it by completely challenging the historical identity of Moses.
He starts with a twist that honestly sounds like an internet conspiracy theory today. He says Moses wasn't actually Jewish.
Correct. Freud argues that Moses was an Egyptian noble.
Now, surely he has more evidence for this than just a hunch.
He builds a historical case like a detective. He starts with the name itself. Moses, or Moshe, isn't a Hebrew name, it's Egyptian. The root Mos simply means child or one born. We see it everywhere in Egyptian royal names like Thutmose, meaning child of Thoth, or Ramos, child of Ra.
Okay, so we have linguistic evidence. What else does he look at?
He looks closely at the practice of circumcision. We tend to think of this as the defining, exclusive mark of the Jewish covenant with God. But Freud cites Herodotus and several other ancient sources that show circumcision was a very common Egyptian custom long before the Hebrew tribes even existed as a unified group. Freud argues Moses forced this Egyptian custom onto his new followers, not to make them Jewish, but to mark them as holy in the elite Egyptian sense.
And then there's that famous detail in the biblical text about Moses having a speech impediment, right? He always needed his brother Aaron to speak for him to the people.
Freud suggests that wasn't a stutter or a physical defect, it was a literal language barrier. If Moses was an Egyptian aristocrat and the people he was leading were Semitic foreigners or slaves, they spoke entirely different languages. He needed an interpreter just to communicate his laws.
Okay, let's assume for a second Freud is right about all this. Moses is a high-ranking Egyptian. Why on earth does an Egyptian noble take a bunch of foreign slaves out into the harsh desert? What's his motivation to leave his life of luxury?
To save a dying religion. This is the most fascinating historical link Freud makes. He connects Moses directly to the reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten.
The famous heretic pharaoh.
Yes, the very first monotheist in recorded history. Akhenaten completely abolished the old polytheistic gods of Egypt, all those animal-headed deities, the vast priesthoods, and established the exclusive worship of a single god, the Aten, which was represented by the sun disk.
Yeah, from what I understand, this wasn't just a case of picking one god out of the pantheon and making him the favorite. This was a totally different type of religion altogether.
It was incredibly abstract. It rejected all magic. It rejected the complex afterlife myths of Osiris. No idols, no statues. It demanded what they called living in truth, or Mahat. It was a strict, highly intellectual, purely ethical religion.
But it didn't last. When Akhenaten died, the empire basically struck back. The old priests of Amun returned to power, and the Aten religion was violently wiped out of the historical record.
The counter-revolution was swift and brutal, and this is exactly where Freud places Moses in the timeline. He argues Moses was a high-ranking follower of Akhenaten, maybe a royal governor or a senior priest. When the pharaoh died and the religion fell apart, Moses refused to let the idea of pure monotheism die with him.
So he goes looking for a new people to carry the torch. He finds these Semitic tribes living in Egypt and decides, you are going to be the vehicle for this grand idea.
He chooses them. That is Freud's explanation for the origin of the chosen people. It wasn't God reaching down from heaven and choosing them. It was this Egyptian noble choosing them to preserve Akhenaten's intellectual religion.
It actually fits together remarkably well. But the traditional story of the Exodus implies that people accepted this new religion and followed him willingly. Freud says that is not exactly what happened.
Right, and this brings us right back to the primal father dynamic we talked about earlier. Freud argues that the strict, abstract, highly demanding religion of the Aten was just too hard for these tribes to bear. It was too intellectual. It offered no comforting magic, no easy rituals, just strict ethical demands in a brutal desert.
So what actually happened out there in the wilderness?
Freud believes, based on psychological patterns and subtle clues he reads in the biblical text, that the Jews eventually rose up in rebellion and killed Moses.
They murdered the father all over again.
History repeats itself perfectly. They couldn't handle the crushing restrictions. They murdered their leader and rejected his demanding religion.
But wait, that creates a massive historical plot hole. If they killed Moses and rejected their religion, why do we have Judaism today? Why do we have the Ten Commandments and monotheism? If they killed the guy, the idea should have died in the sand right there.
This is where the actual history gets messy, and Freud uses what's called the merger theory. Years after the murder, these tribes, still wandering, eventually merged with completely different tribes in the region who worshipped an entirely different god. A fierce, local volcano god named Yahweh.
Yahweh.
Yes. And Yahweh was not the calm, ethical God of Moses. He was bloodthirsty, highly emotional, intensely local. He lived on a specific mountain and demanded blood sacrifices. But the tribes merged for survival. And in that political and cultural merger, they fused the two distinct historical figures together. The Egyptian liberator Moses was fused with a Midianite priest of Yahweh.
So they basically took the name Yahweh and the mountain god traditions, but they kept Moses' reputation as the ultimate lawgiver.
Exactly. It was a cultural compromise. They kept Yahweh's violent, protective nature, but they held on to Moses' practice of circumcision and, crucially, the lingering, faint idea of a single supreme God.
But this is the part I really struggle with in Freud's timeline. How does the concept of the one God, the highly ethical, strict God of Akhenaten, survive if they violently suppressed it for centuries after murdering Moses?
Freud explains this by introducing the psychological concept of latency. Think about how a childhood trauma works in a single person. Let's say a child experiences something truly terrible. Often they don't process it or react immediately. They repress it entirely. They forget it ever happened. This is the latency period. But then, years or even decades later, often triggered by something in adulthood, the trauma violently resurfaces.
It comes back as nightmares or severe anxiety or unexplainable phobias.
Exactly. Freud takes this individual PTSD model and applies it to an entire civilization. He argues the historical murder of Moses was repressed by the collective memory. The people tried desperately to forget they killed their great leader, but the guilt remained. It simmered in the cultural subconscious for centuries.
And when did the latency period end? When did it resurface?
With the rise of the Jewish prophets. Centuries later, these prophets suddenly began preaching a God who wasn't just a local, angry volcano god who wanted burnt offerings, but a universal God of strict justice, a God of pure ethics. Freud argues this was the psychological return of the repressed. The old murdered God of Moses was forcing his way back to the surface of the culture through the immense guilt of the people.
So when the prophets were crying out in the street saying, "We have sinned and God is punishing us," they were technically right, but strictly in a psychological sense.
In Freud's secular view, yes. They didn't consciously remember the ancient murder of Moses, but they felt the massive, unexplained, inherited guilt. The feeling of being chosen gave them incredible self-confidence to survive, but the deep guilt made them feel they were constantly unworthy and being punished by that same God.
That is such a tragic, heavy view of human history. It implies it's all just a relentless cycle of unhealed trauma. And this leads us to the final chapter of the theory. How does this massive cycle of guilt evolve into Christianity? Because Freud has a very specific take on St. Paul that connects all these ancient dots together.
It connects everything perfectly. Freud argues that Paul of Tarsus, St. Paul, was a man of unbelievable psychological intuition. He intuitively grasped the deep source of this universal gnawing guilt that humanity felt but couldn't name. He realized, on a subconscious level, that it all stemmed from the primal crime, the murder of the primal father.
Which Freud says Paul branded as original sin.
Exactly. Paul framed it as original sin, a stain, a crime against God that every single human is born with. And because Paul diagnosed the disease, he was able to propose a cure, a way to finally, permanently end the guilt that had been building up since the prehistoric primal horde.
And the cure was the ultimate sacrifice.
Yes. His proposition was brilliant in its psychological symmetry. He said it was a son of God who sacrificed himself to atone for the guilt. Paul basically said to humanity, we, the brothers, killed the father, so now the ultimate son must die to pay the blood debt and balance the cosmic scales.
So by sacrificing the son Jesus, the ancient guilt of the brothers is finally cleansed. The debt is paid.
Right. It offered tremendous, immediate psychological relief. That's why the new religion spread so incredibly fast across the Roman Empire. But Freud points out a massive, ironic shift here. By engaging in this sacrifice, Christianity fundamentally became a son religion. The son takes the place of the father. The father's wrath is appeased, sure, but the son is now the central hero.
It completely displaced the father-centric religion of the Jews.
Yes. And Freud, being a secular Jew himself who deeply admired intellectual rigor, actually views this shift as a cultural regression.
Regression. That seems a bit harsh. Why did he think Christianity was a step backward if it cured the guilt?
Because while Christianity offered emotional relief from the crushing guilt, it abandoned the strict, highly intellectual, abstract monotheism of Moses. It brought back a lot of the old pagan elements to make the religion easier for the masses to swallow.
You mean things like praying to saints and physical rituals?
Exactly. To Freud's psychoanalytic eye, the concept of the Trinity looks an awful lot like a return to polytheism. The veneration of saints looks exactly like worshiping minor, local deities. And the ritual of communion. That looks exactly like the ancient totem meal, eating the physical flesh and drinking the blood of the god to internalize his magical strength. Freud saw it as completely reintroducing the magic and superstition that Akhenaten and Moses had fought so hard to banish.
So let's zoom out and look at this whole historical arc Freud has drawn. It starts with something as small as a neurotic woman compulsively arranging a tablecloth to hide her husband's shame. It moves to a prehistoric horde, murdering their alpha male leader and inventing morality out of sheer guilt.
Then it moves to an Egyptian noble named Moses, trying to save a pure monotheistic religion, only to be murdered by his own resentful people in the desert.
Right, and finally, that repressed guilt resurfacing centuries later as the strict ethical God of the Jews, eventually culminating in the Christian atonement where the son dies to pay for the original murder.
That is the complete chain. It's a relentless, unbroken chain of psychological cause and effect spanning millennia.
And the overarching why behind it all, the reason we do all this, is that for Freud, God isn't a metaphysical truth out in the cosmos. He is simply a psychological necessity.
He is the ultimate projection of the father complex. We built this entire massive structure called religion just to manage the crushing guilt of our own violent history and our desperate childlike need for a father figure to protect us from the dark.
It really fundamentally changes how you look at the whole debate between atheism and religion.
Yeah.
It's not about logic or proving whether God exists in the sky with a telescope. It's about understanding why he exists so vividly in our minds.
And it challenges us to ask some very uncomfortable questions. Are we really as civilized as we think we are? Or are we all just sophisticated neurotics, endlessly, blindly reenacting a primal crime we committed thousands of years ago?
That is exactly the question, and I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought based on everything we've unpacked today. If Freud is right, and our entire concept of God, of authority, of morality, is based on a repressed memory of a murdered father and the guilt that followed, is it actually possible to ever be a true atheist?
That is the paradox, isn't it?
Right. Or are we, psychologically speaking, just completely hardwired to look for the Father in everything we do? If we tear down religion, do we just project that same father complex onto our political leaders, our celebrities, or even our absolute faith in science? Can humanity ever actually stop being the guilty sons constantly looking for the dad we killed?
That is definitely a thought that will keep you up at night.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Freud's hidden and very bloody history of God. We'll see you next time on Thinking Deeper.